The snow glistened under Russian sunlight, soft and pure, as if nature itself wanted to believe in the illusion. The Winter Olympics of 2014 were supposed to be the crowning moment of Vladimir Putin's Russia, a spectacle of power, pride, and perfection. Billions of dollars had been poured into Sochi, a quiet resort city by the Black Sea. Roads, stadiums, ski jumps, hotels, all built from nothing. The world was told that Sochi would be the grandest, cleanest, and most secure games in history. But beneath the ice, something else was being built. Something invisible. Something carefully designed to fool the entire world. Sochi wasn't just a celebration of sport. It was a stage, and behind the curtain, Russia was preparing one of the most sophisticated acts of deception the Olympics had ever seen. For decades, the Olympics had been a battlefield of ideology. In 1980, Moscow had hosted its own games under the shadow of the Cold War. In 1984, Los Angeles had answered with capitalist glamour. But by 2014, Russia's message was different. The Soviet Union was gone, the chaos of the 1990s forgotten. Putin's Russia was strong, rich, modern, and unbreakable. Hosting the Winter Olympics was meant to prove that to the world. And not just to the world, to Russians themselves. The price was astronomical. Officially, the games cost $50 billion, the most expensive in history. Unofficially, much of that money vanished into the pockets of oligarchs, construction magnates, and state insiders. The corruption was breathtaking, but the propaganda was perfect. Television ads showed smiling athletes, snow-covered peaks, and flags fluttering under blue skies. Putin appeared everywhere, shaking hands with workers, inspecting venues, promising glory. Sochi would be Russia's statement to history. And to make that statement unforgettable, the Kremlin wanted victory. Not just medals. Dominance. The pressure fell on the athletes, and even more on the scientists. For years, whispers of Russian doping had haunted sports. The Soviet Union had pioneered the science of enhancement during the Cold War, turning performance into an experiment of ideology. After its collapse, the system fractured, but the mindset never disappeared. Winning wasn't just about pride, it was proof of national strength. By 2011, with Sochi approaching, officials inside the Russian Ministry of Sport began planning a new system. One that could guarantee success, protect its athletes, and evade detection. At the center of it all stood Dr. Grigory Rodchenkov, a brilliant, eccentric biochemist with a chaotic genius. He was the head of Moscow's anti-doping laboratory, the very place tasked with keeping the Olympics clean. But Rodchenkov was not just testing athletes. He was helping them cheat. Rodchenkov's life was a contradiction. Scientist and conspirator, patriot and whistleblower in waiting. He loved his country, but he also loved mischief. He joked about Operation Sochi, as if it were a spy thriller, and in a way it was. He developed a special cocktail of banned substances, mixing anabolic steroids with liquor, whiskey for men, vermouth for women, so that the chemicals would pass through the body faster, leaving almost no trace. The formula was codenamed the Duchess. The athletes would drink it before competition, the drugs would enhance their performance, and by the time the tests came, they'd appear clean. But even the best chemistry had limits. To truly secure results, Russia needed something more: control over the testing itself. That's where the real conspiracy began. The plan was audacious. During the Sochi Games, every athlete's urine samples would be collected and sealed in tamper-proof bottles. Those bottles would be stored overnight in the official testing lab, under supervision, cameras, and security. No one could open them without detection. But Russia had a way. Rodchenkov worked closely with the Federal Security Service, the FSB, the successor to the KGB. Together, they designed a method to secretly open the supposedly unbreakable bottles, swap the dirty urine for clean samples, and reseal them without trace. It was an operation worthy of a spy movie. The FSB even built a secret room next to the official lab in Sochi, hidden behind an unmarked door. At night, agents would pass bottles through a small hole in the wall, swap their contents, and return them before dawn. On paper, the athletes were clean. In reality, they were the product of the most elaborate doping scheme in Olympic history. Rodchenkov described those nights as surreal. Dozens of bottles lined up like soldiers, technicians whispering in the dark, the smell of chemicals and adrenaline in the air. He would later recall, "It was like running a criminal operation inside the Olympics, and everyone pretended it was science." Over 100 Russian athletes were involved, including gold medalists. Each one had a clean urine sample stored in advance, frozen months before to be used during the Games. The scheme worked flawlessly. Russia dominated Sochi, winning 33 medals, 13 of them gold. It was the nation's best Winter Olympic performance in decades. Putin smiled for the cameras, congratulating the athletes. The world applauded. The anthem played again and again. No one suspected a thing. The triumph was absolute. Russia had proven itself. The propaganda machine declared it a new era of greatness. But secrets have a way of leaking, especially when they involve too many hands. After the Games ended, tensions began to rise inside the Ministry of Sport. Rodchenkov knew too much. Some of his colleagues had started talking too freely. And international investigators, suspicious of previous Russian test anomalies, began asking quiet questions. Rodchenkov felt the pressure closing in. He had built the system, but he wasn't untouchable. He later said he began to fear for his life. In Russia, he said, truth is a dangerous thing to know. And then suddenly everything began to unravel. A few months after Sochi in late 2014, a German documentary aired on television, an investigation into Russian doping. It featured athletes, whistleblowers, and hidden footage from inside training facilities. The report was explosive. The world began to connect the dots. Suspicious test patterns. Disappearing samples. Coaches with KGB ties. The World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, launched an official investigation. And at the center of it all, one name kept appearing, Grigory Rodchenkov. The man who had built the system was now being hunted by it. He fled Russia, carrying with him documents, hard drives, and a story that would shake the foundations of world sport. He arrived in the United States exhausted, paranoid, and carrying the truth. For years he had lied, cheated, manipulated data for the government, but now he was ready to confess. His story would soon become the backbone of one of the greatest scandals in modern history. And as the world listened, what began as whispers of doping turned into an indictment of an entire state. A conspiracy that reached from the laboratories of Moscow to the heart of the Kremlin. The Sochi Games, it turned out, were not built on snow and pride. They were built on deception. And the world had believed every word. When Grigory Rodchenkov landed in Los Angeles, he carried no medals, no fanfare, no pride. He carried a secret. A secret heavy enough to bring down a nation's illusion of glory. He checked into a small hotel under a false name. He barely slept. For years he had lived inside laboratories surrounded by silence, by rules, by fear. Now he was in a new world, free but hunted. Every time a car slowed down outside his window, he imagined it was them, the men he once worked for, the ones who never forgave betrayal. He had fled Russia with documents, flash drives, and data. Proof of what had really happened in Sochi. He didn't know who to trust. But he knew the truth had to come out. In Russia, 2 of his former colleagues had already died under mysterious circumstances. The official cause, heart attacks. Both men were healthy, middle-aged, and connected to the doping program. Rodchenkov understood the message. In Moscow, the government denied everything. The Ministry of Sport dismissed the German documentary as propaganda, a Western attempt to discredit Russian success. State media went further, calling Rodchenkov a traitor, a criminal, a mad scientist who had gone rogue. But in the United States, something else was happening. A filmmaker named Brian Fogel was working on a small personal project, a documentary about how easy it was for athletes to cheat drug tests. He had been in touch with anti-doping experts around the world when he stumbled upon a name. Someone told him, "If you want to know how the system really works, talk to Grigory. Their meeting would change everything." Rodchenkov appeared on camera for the first time, nervous but intense, his eyes sharp behind thick glasses. He spoke English in bursts, mixing humor with fear, brilliance with paranoia. He didn't just confess, he explained, in detail with charts, names and formulas, how the Duchess cocktail worked. How the FSB had drilled a hole in the wall of the Sochi lab to swap urine bottles. How government ministers had overseen the entire operation. Every word he said tore another piece off the facade of Russian honor. As he spoke, his story grew darker. He described late-night phone calls from Moscow, coded messages, encrypted instructions. He remembered standing inside the Sochi lab at 2 a.m. holding two identical bottles, one clean, one dirty, and knowing the difference between victory and disgrace was just a few drops of urine. He said, "We were part of a theater. Everyone played their role, the scientists, the agents, the athletes. We were writing a fantasy. And the world applauded it." When Brian Fogel began recording the documentary that would become Icarus, he didn't realize he was documenting a geopolitical explosion. As the footage accumulated, the truth became undeniable. Fogel's cameras captured Rodchenkov's fear. His nightmares, his paranoia, his calls with lawyers and FBI agents. The man who had once been Russia's most powerful anti-doping scientist now lived like a ghost, looking over his shoulder, moving from one safe location to another. Meanwhile, investigators at the World Anti-Doping Agency were piecing together the same puzzle. WADA's commission, led by Canadian lawyer Richard McLaren, began interviewing witnesses, analyzing test data, comparing patterns across years. The results were staggering. The McLaren report, published in 2016, concluded that the Russian state had operated a systematic doping program across dozens of sports, involving the Ministry of Sport, the FSB, and the country's top athletes. More than 1,000 athletes were implicated. The report didn't just accuse individuals. It accused a government. The evidence included emails, spreadsheets, and test results that matched Rodchenkov's descriptions perfectly. The hole in the wall at Sochi's lab was real. The tampered bottles were real. The names, the medals, the lies, all real. The fallout was immediate and global. WADA recommended that Russia be banned from international competition. The International Olympic Committee was forced to act, reluctantly, painfully. For the first time in modern history, an entire nation was facing collective punishment. In Moscow, the reaction was fury. Putin called the accusations a political plot, an attempt to humiliate Russia on the world stage. The state doubled down on denial. They claimed Rodchenkov was mentally unstable, a criminal trying to save himself by slandering his country. Russian television ran segments calling him the man who sold his soul. His family back home was harassed. Friends cut contact. His name became a curse. Rodchenkov, now living under protection in the U.S., received word that his life was in danger. American authorities placed him under witness security. He vanished again, this time into the anonymity of survival. But his words, once spoken, could not be buried. The story spread like wildfire. News outlets called it the biggest scandal in the history of sports. The New York Times ran front-page exposés. Governments demanded accountability. The IOC was torn between outrage and fear. Punishing Russia meant punishing one of its most powerful members. Looking away meant destroying what little credibility remained. They tried to balance justice and diplomacy, a tightrope no one could walk cleanly. In 2016, with the Rio Olympics approaching, the IOC faced its moment of truth. WADA urged a total ban on Russia. But the IOC hesitated. Instead, they allowed Russian athletes to compete, but under strict scrutiny. Some were banned, others cleared. The message was muddled. The punishment diluted. To many, it looked like the IOC had chosen politics over principle. For the first time, the Olympic rings themselves were questioned. What did they really stand for? Excellence? Fair play? Or something else? Something more human, more corrupt, more real? Athletes from other nations spoke out in anger. "We competed against ghosts," one said. "They stole our medals and the world applauded them." In the United States, Rodchenkov became a reluctant symbol. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a survivor of a system that had consumed him. He often said, "I didn't create corruption. I just perfected it." The scandal fractured global sport. Entire federations were questioned. Olympic results were re-examined. Dozens of medals were stripped from Russian athletes. Years of competition rewritten. But justice came unevenly. Some doped athletes escaped punishment, some innocent ones were caught in the fallout. The truth, once shattered, was impossible to reassemble. By 2017, Rodchenkov's testimony had become the cornerstone of Icarus, the documentary that would later win the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. When the film premiered, it shocked audiences worldwide. For the first time, people saw the face of the man who had built and destroyed Russia's doping empire. On screen he came across as tragic, part genius, part victim, part confessor. Laughing through fear. Crying through guilt. He said, "I loved sport. I believed in it. But I also believed in my country. And when those two things collided, something inside me broke." In Russia, the backlash was brutal. The state launched its own investigations, not into doping but into betrayal. They opened criminal cases against Rodchenkov. They painted him as a traitor, a liar, a Western puppet. The Kremlin's message was simple: the real crime wasn't cheating, it was talking. But the damage was done. The Sochi Olympics, once hailed as the greatest in Russian history, were now a synonym for deceit. And yet, inside Russia, many didn't care. The medals had been won. The anthem had been played. For millions, that was all that mattered. For the rest of the world, the scandal forced a reckoning. If doping could be organized by a government, if results could be rewritten in laboratories under the flag of a superpower, then what did the Olympics really mean? The McLaren report's findings spread far beyond sport. They exposed a truth about power, that when image matters more than integrity, corruption becomes inevitable. The Olympics had always been political, but Sochi had turned it into theater. And for once, the world had seen the stage from behind the curtain. The snow, the lights, the glory, all of it built on lies. Rodchenkov disappeared into a life without identity. He wrote his memoir, The Rodchenkov Affair, behind layers of protection. His face aged faster. His laughter, once chaotic, turned quiet. He said he missed home even as he feared it. When asked if he regretted what he'd done, he paused for a long time. Then he said, "I regret that truth was the last thing anyone wanted." In the Kremlin, silence was never just silence. It was calculation. When the world accused Russia of orchestrating the largest doping scheme in history, the response was swift and familiar: denial, deflection, and pride. To admit guilt would be to admit weakness, and weakness was something Vladimir Putin's Russia could never show. State television called the allegations an American fantasy. Officials lined up behind the podiums, calm, composed, repeating the same phrases: "We follow all international regulations. There is no evidence. This is a political attack." The truth was not the point. The performance was. Inside Russia, the narrative turned. The country wasn't on trial for cheating. It was under attack. The West, they said, couldn't handle Russian success. It was jealousy disguised as justice. Propaganda turned the scandal into a patriotic rally. Posters of the Sochi champions remained on billboards. Interviews with gold medalists aired on primetime television. Their victories were now symbols of resistance, proof that Russia's greatness could not be erased by Western lies. But behind the cameras, the damage was real. The Russian anti-doping agency, RUSADA, was suspended. The Moscow laboratory was shut down. Dozens of coaches and officials lost their credentials. And the athletes, the ones who had followed orders, were left in limbo. Some wept as they returned their medals. Others refused. They stood on podiums of denial, insisting their blood was clean, their conscience clear. Many had no idea how deep the deception ran. They were pawns in a game too large to see. In Lausanne, the International Olympic Committee faced its own reckoning. The McLaren report had left no room for doubt, yet the IOC hesitated. It was the same hesitation that had haunted every scandal in Olympic history. The organization that claimed to protect the purity of sport now had to decide whether to confront one of its most powerful members. Money, politics, and reputation hung in the balance. Russia was a cornerstone of the Olympic movement, a country of history, medals, and influence. Banning it entirely could fracture the games themselves. So the IOC chose a middle path. At the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, Russia would not be allowed to compete as a nation. Its flag and anthem were banned. But clean Russian athletes could still participate, under a neutral banner as the Olympic athletes from Russia. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. To the world it looked like weakness. To Russia it looked like war. On state television, commentators mocked the IOC's decision. "They think they can take away our flag," one said. "Let them try to take our spirit." The Kremlin called it discrimination. Putin himself appeared calm, almost amused. "We will not humiliate ourselves," he said. "Our athletes will prove their greatness again, with or without a flag." And they did. In Pyeongchang, the neutral Russians, wearing gray uniforms, competing under the Olympic flag, won gold in ice hockey. When they stood on the podium, they sang their anthem anyway, loud and defiant, their hands pressed over invisible flags. The crowd erupted. For a moment the scandal seemed forgotten. The world watched, half in awe, half in disbelief. It was the perfect metaphor, the power of image over truth, pride over consequence. But the stain didn't fade. It spread. Investigators discovered more evidence. Data tampering, falsified records, continued interference from Moscow. Even after the world had caught them, the machinery of deception hadn't stopped. It had simply adapted. In 2019, WADA once again banned Russia, this time for 4 years, from all major sporting events, including the Tokyo 2020 Olympics and the 2022 World Cup. The punishment was unprecedented. The reaction predictable. Russian officials called it Russophobia. They said the West was afraid of Russian dominance. They said sports had become politics, as if they hadn't made it political themselves. And yet, beneath the outrage there was exhaustion. For the athletes it never ended. Every test, every medal, every record carried suspicion. Even those who were innocent bore the weight of a nation's guilt. For the rest of the world, the scandal had turned into something larger, a symbol of corruption not just in sport but in truth itself. The IOC tried to repair its image. Press conferences, ethics reforms, new technology to detect doping, all performed with the enthusiasm of repentance. But the world's faith had already cracked. When people watched the Olympics now, they no longer saw purity. They saw politics, money, manipulation. They saw men in suits smiling for cameras while athletes bled for symbols. Rodchenkov, hidden somewhere in America, watched all of it from afar. He saw his country turn his name into an insult. He saw the IOC bend under pressure. He saw the flame of the Olympics, once sacred to him, flicker under the weight of hypocrisy. In an interview he said softly, "The system survives because everyone benefits. Athletes get medals. Governments get pride. Companies get profit. No one really wants it to end." And perhaps he was right. When the Tokyo Olympics arrived, delayed by the pandemic, the ban was technically still in effect. But once again Russian athletes competed, this time under a new name, ROC, the Russian Olympic Committee. The uniforms were white, blue, and red, just like the flag they were supposedly banned from using. The anthem was replaced by music from Tchaikovsky. The difference was cosmetic. To the world it was another illusion, another compromise disguised as fairness. The same game with a new label. The world had changed since Sochi, but the pattern hadn't. Cheating wasn't just an act anymore. It was a system. A culture. And perhaps the most terrifying truth was this: Russia wasn't alone. Whispers spread through other nations. Athletes quietly banned, federations covering up results, sponsors protecting stars. Every system that claimed to fight doping had a reason to hide it. Too much money, too much image, too much to lose. Sochi had not been an exception. It had been the revelation of a truth no one wanted to face, that purity in global sport was a fantasy, a story told to sell hope. Back in Russia, the medals remained displayed in glass cases. The athletes still smiled for interviews. The government still spoke of victory. And the snow of Sochi, once a symbol of purity, melted quietly into the Black Sea. Rodchenkov once wrote, "Snow melts. Lies do too. But only when the sun comes out." The question was, would the world ever let it? In the months after the second ban, the shock began to fade. Not because the world had healed, but because the world had learned to move on. Outrage, like everything else in modern sport, had a season. The headlines disappeared. The cameras turned elsewhere. And the games went on. But beneath the silence, the machinery of sport kept grinding, powerful, relentless, hungry. The truth was uncomfortable. Russia had cheated. But Russia had also been caught. And that made them, in some strange way, less dangerous than the ones who hadn't been. Because Sochi had exposed more than a crime, it had exposed a system of incentives that ran deeper than any single nation. In the boardrooms of the International Olympic Committee, the same logic still ruled. Money, spectacle, and control. The Olympic movement had grown too large to fail, too profitable to pause, too political to purify. Television rights generated billions. Sponsors depended on the image of human perfection. Governments used medals as propaganda. Every participant, every institution had something to gain from looking away. It wasn't just Russia. It was everyone who needed the story to stay beautiful. The laboratories that had once been sanctuaries of science became fortresses of secrecy. National federations sent their own delegates to supervise tests. Some results disappeared before they were published. Others were quietly altered. WADA, the global watchdog, had limited power. It could investigate, but it couldn't enforce. Its funding came from the same governments it was supposed to police. The IOC itself contributed to its budget. Independence was an illusion. And when illusions fund themselves, truth becomes optional. In 2018, a leaked report revealed that doping cases had been quietly buried in several countries, not just Russia. Track and field, weightlifting, cycling, swimming, the patterns were the same. Positive tests downgraded to warnings. Suspensions reduced. Files lost. One scientist who worked for a national anti-doping lab described it simply. They all do it. The difference is who gets caught and when. That sentence, more than any statistic, captured the new era of sport, an era defined by denial, not purity. Rodchenkov watched this unfold from exile, hidden somewhere behind tinted windows and unmarked doors. He was older now, his once chaotic energy dulled by solitude. But his mind was as sharp as ever. He kept writing, sending encrypted messages to journalists and investigators. He warned that the system hadn't changed, it had only grown smarter. You can destroy a lab, he said, but you cannot destroy a culture built on winning at any cost. And in many ways he was right. The culture of performance had become indistinguishable from the culture of deceit. From the training centers to the boardrooms, success was the only morality that mattered. Athletes lived under impossible pressure. The line between dedication and destruction had blurred. 1/100th of a second could change a life, or erase it. The sponsors wanted records. The fans wanted miracles. The federations wanted dominance. And the athletes? They just wanted to survive. For every medal ceremony, there was a quiet room somewhere in the world where an athlete looked at a syringe, a pill, or a vial, and made a choice between ethics and existence. The Sochi scandal hadn't ended doping, it had industrialized hypocrisy. The Olympics had always claimed to unite humanity, to rise above politics and greed. But Sochi had shown the opposite, that the games were not an escape from the world, but its reflection. Corruption didn't taint the Olympics. The Olympics absorbed it, adapted it, and turned it into part of the show. When medals were stripped years later, when records were erased, when victories were reclassified as lies, the moment had already passed. The cameras had moved on. The glory remained frozen in time. The athletes who lost to doped competitors never stood on their podiums. Their anthems never played. Justice came too late to matter. And yet, every 4 years, the flame was lit again. The same rituals, the same speeches, the same words about honor and unity. The theater continued. Inside the IOC headquarters, the walls gleamed as always, portraits of presidents, flags of nations, a museum of controlled memory. The organization had survived scandal after scandal, decade after decade, because it had mastered one truth: time erases everything. The IOC didn't need to win arguments. It only needed to outlast them. And the world let it. Because in the end, the Olympics weren't about the IOC or even the athletes. They were about us, the spectators. We needed the myth. We needed to believe that human effort could still transcend corruption. That belief was the real product the Olympics sold. Meanwhile in Russia the propaganda machine kept spinning. State media released documentaries claiming that Rodchenkov was a CIA agent, that the doping scandal was fabricated to destroy Russian sport. Officials handed out medals to the same athletes who had been banned. They posed for photos, smiling under chandeliers, holding awards that meant nothing, and yet, to millions, meant everything. The truth had lost the war of perception. Rodchenkov lived under witness protection, his name erased from public record. He often said he dreamed of running again, not for victory but for escape. In his journals he wrote about freedom, guilt, and absurdity. "I built a system to deceive the world," he wrote. "And now I live trapped in its shadow." The irony was unbearable. The man who had corrupted the Olympics was now its only honest voice. He knew the games would go on. He knew no confession could undo what had been done. But he also knew that exposing the lie had meaning, even if it changed nothing. And yet, the Sochi scandal did change something, not in the Olympics but in the way the world saw power. It revealed that the line between politics and sport was gone. That global institutions could lie with a smile. That truth in the modern age wasn't something discovered, it was something negotiated. The same patterns began to appear everywhere, in business, in media, in government. Sochi was no longer a sports story. It was a parable about the 21st century. When WADA released its final report, one line stood out above all others. Corruption thrives in darkness, but darkness thrives in applause. It was poetry disguised as bureaucracy. And it was true. The applause was what made it all possible. The cheers, the flags, the tears, the national pride. The world didn't want to see the dirt. The world wanted the story. And so the story continued. By 2022, as the next Winter Games began in Beijing, the irony was complete. A new superpower, another tightly controlled state, another billion-dollar spectacle of perfection. The world had learned nothing, or perhaps, it had simply learned to live with the lie. The flame burned again. The athletes marched again. The cameras rolled. And somewhere in an undisclosed location, a man who had once built that illusion watched from behind a curtain, whispering to himself, "It never ends." The flame always dies the same way, quietly. The final cheers fade, the snow melts, and the world moves on. But the smoke that rises from the torch never truly disappears. It lingers, invisible, carried by wind and memory. Sochi's flame was no different. It burned brighter than any before it, illuminating the power and pride of a nation reborn. But when it went out, it left behind a darkness that stretched far beyond Russia's borders. For a while, the games had been everything they were meant to be: dazzling, emotional, unforgettable. The arenas were perfect, the ceremonies majestic, the medals heavy with meaning. But what the world had witnessed was not a triumph of human spirit. It was a triumph of illusion. Every system needs its myths, and the Olympics are humanity's greatest one. The idea that sport exists beyond politics, beyond greed, beyond corruption. The belief that, for a few weeks every 4 years, the world can be pure again. But Sochi shattered that myth. It revealed that behind the beauty, behind every anthem, every flag, every victory, lies a machinery of control. Scientists, spies, politicians, and bureaucrats, all working together to protect a story. Because that story sells hope. And hope in the modern world is priceless. For Russia, the Sochi Games were never about sport. They were about power, the projection of strength, the rewriting of image, the illusion of moral victory. Putin's Russia wanted to prove that it could command not just territory but narrative. And for 2 shining weeks it did. The medals glittered. The anthem roared. The world applauded. But lies, no matter how grand, always crumble under their own weight. When the truth came out, it didn't just expose a scandal. It exposed a mirror, one that reflected every compromise the world was willing to make in exchange for a beautiful story. Because the world wanted to believe. It needed to. That's why the Sochi Games worked so perfectly. They told everyone what they wanted to hear. That greatness is pure, that effort is everything, that nations can unite through sport. And when the truth arrived, when the bottles, the documents, the data appeared, the world didn't rage as much as it sighed. It was easier to look away. For the athletes who played by the rules, Sochi became a wound that never healed. They trained for years, sacrificed everything, and lost not to talent but to chemistry. Their names never made the headlines. Their podiums were occupied by ghosts. For the Russian athletes, many became prisoners of their own victories. They had been part of something larger than themselves, something that promised glory and delivered shame. Some stayed silent. Some fled. Some still insist even today that they were clean. And maybe, in their own way, they were clean of choice, not of circumstance. Grigory Rodchenkov lives now under a different name, behind locked doors and coded calls. His face has aged, his voice carries the weight of exile. He still laughs sometimes, a short, broken laugh that sounds like disbelief turned into survival. He once said, "The hardest thing about telling the truth is realizing how little people want to hear it." And yet he told it anyway. For all the madness, the guilt, the fear, he gave the world something rare. Proof that even in a system built on lies, one man can still choose honesty, even if it costs everything. In the end, Rodchenkov didn't destroy the Olympics. He revealed them. What Sochi left behind was not just scandal, it was understanding. Understanding that corruption is not a glitch in human systems. It is a feature. That perfection is an illusion we build because reality is too complicated to love. That the Olympic flame, for all its glory, is just fire, and fire can burn as easily as it can inspire. The Games survived, of course. They always do. The IOC rebranded, the sponsors returned, the snow fell somewhere else. New scandals came, new champions rose, new flags waved. And Sochi became a chapter, a cautionary tale buried beneath fresh layers of celebration. But its echo remains. Every time a record falls. Every time a medal is hung. Every time the flame is lit. Because now, somewhere in the back of our minds, we know. We know that behind the beauty lies the bargain. Behind the purity, the price. The Olympics have never been about innocence. They've been about resilience, the human capacity to keep believing, even when belief has been broken. Maybe that's why we keep watching. Because we don't watch for perfection. We watch for defiance, for the fragile proof that, even inside systems built on deceit, people can still do something extraordinary. Sochi was not the end of the Olympic dream. It was the moment we realized what that dream cost. And maybe, in some twisted way, that truth makes the flame more beautiful. Because the light we see now is not pure. It's flawed. It's human. It's real. The flame still burns, not in spite of the lies but because of them. It burns as a reminder that truth and deception will always share the same torch. And it burns for those who still dare to believe. In the end, every flame burns for the same reason, to be seen. The Sochi Games promised glory, but what they revealed was truth. A truth about power, deception, and the cost of perfection. Maybe that's what makes the Olympics so human. Not the victories, not the medals, but the struggle to keep believing even when the illusion cracks. Because every torch carries two fires, one for the dream and one for the lie. And it's up to us to decide which one we keep alive. If this story opened your eyes, don't let it fade with the credits. Subscribe now, because every day we uncover another hidden chapter from the Olympic world. The glory, the darkness, the legends, the secrets. 2 stories, every single day, the truth behind the gold. Until tomorrow, when the next flame begins to burn.